The students sat in their seats, some floating slightly above their desks, others shifting uncomfortably in shapes that hardly fit the human concept of chairs. Their diverse forms were as varied as the galaxies from which they hailed, scaled, furred, even ethereal beings made up of translucent energy swirled in faint outlines. The classroom was a wonder of interstellar design, an expansive dome surrounded by walls of shimmering light and holographic displays that projected stars and galaxies in high definition. Yet, for all the technological marvels, there was an undeniable tension in the air. They were here for a history lesson, and not just any history. Today's subject was Earth, an odd little planet on the fringes of a relatively small solar system. Most students considered it a curiosity at best, an irrelevant rock that had barely clawed its way into the galactic community. The course title, Humanity's Historical Warfare. Several of the students exchanged glances, their eyes, or equivalents, rolling in disbelief. Warfare? What could a species that only recently joined the galactic fold have to teach them about something as ancient as conflict? In their minds, warfare was a relic of the past, an unnecessary exercise left behind in favor of diplomacy and unity. As they murmured in their respective languages and frequencies, a shift in the ambient lighting caught their attention. At the front of the room, the hollow pedestal flickered, and in a split second, a figure materialized. Standing tall, the image of a human professor in formal attire appeared. The hologram was precise, lifelike in its detail, though devoid of any emotional expression, just a tool of the station, not a real person. His eyes scanned the room, or rather, the program did, acknowledging each species present with the calculated neutrality of an AI. "Welcome, students," the professor's voice echoed. "Today, we explore the history of humanity's relationship with warfare. It is not a history of peace, but one of survival. Of evolution through conflict." A collective silence fell over the room, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Some of the students perked up, their initial disinterest fading. Others remained skeptical, their postures betraying doubt. Conflict as evolution? That was a notion many of them had discarded eons ago. "Before we begin," the professor continued, "I must ask you to set aside your assumptions. Humanity's development of warfare is not like what many of you may be accustomed to in your own histories. For them, it was never about territorial expansion or dominance over resources. It was about something much more primal, survival." The first images began to appear in the air, projected in stunning clarity. Depictions of Earth, green forests, vast oceans, cities sprawling across continents. And then the shift, humans wielding crude weapons, engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat in ancient times. Swords clashing, shields splintering, screams filling the air. The reaction from the students was immediate. A species that resembled a mass of floating crystals shimmered faintly, its color changing in response to surprise. Another student, whose gelatinous form rippled whenever it reacted to strong emotions, quivered visibly. For most of them, these early, crude displays of violence seemed barbaric, almost primitive. "You might see this and think it's unsophisticated," the professor's voice was calm, measured. "But consider this, these conflicts shaped the very fabric of human societies. Tribes, city-states, nations, all of them formed through constant battle for survival. Those who adapted, lived. Those who didn't, disappeared. Warfare, for humans, was a crucible of natural selection." One of the students, a being with scaled skin and eyes resembling those of a hawk, clicked its talons together in a gesture of skepticism. "Surely, such conflict can't be unique to humans. Many of our worlds also had early periods of warfare, yet we evolved beyond it." "That is correct," the professor nodded, acknowledging the point. But humanity's wars did not cease as their technology advanced. Instead, they evolved alongside them, becoming more sophisticated, more devastating. The images changed again, now showing the invention of projectile weapons, bows, cannons, firearms. The alien students flinched at the sight of humans using such destructive tools against each other. To them, such methods seemed archaic, unnecessary. But they couldn't deny the precision, the cold efficiency with which humans honed these skills. And yet, humanity didn't stop there, the professor continued. What you see as barbaric was, to them, the very thing that allowed them to develop into a society that could survive the harsh realities of their world. Their planet, Earth, was not a paradise. It was filled with threats, both external and internal. An alien with blue, iridescent skin raised a hand, well, something like a hand. But they had the option of diplomacy, did they not? Surely, not all of their conflicts were resolved through violence. Ah, the professor smiled slightly, or at least the holographic representation of him did. They did indeed attempt diplomacy, many times. But more often than not, those efforts failed, leading to even greater conflicts. However, those very failures in diplomacy taught humanity a unique lesson: how to manipulate, outwit, and outlast their enemies. The alien students shifted in their seats again, some whispering among themselves in languages that reverberated like waves, others quietly absorbing the lesson. What they were learning was slowly reshaping their understanding. Human warfare wasn't just senseless violence. It was strategic, purposeful. There was an intelligence behind every move, every sacrifice. Humanity's wars shaped not just their civilizations, but their minds, their instincts, the professor went on. They became a species capable of thinking several steps ahead, preparing for threats they hadn't yet encountered. Their technological advancements weren't just tools, they were weapons, ready for defense or offense. A paradox of a species, both creators and destroyers. At this, one of the more peaceful species in the classroom, a floating cloud of bioluminescent gas, pulsed with soft hues of confusion. But surely, they must have outgrown this? No civilization can sustain itself through constant warfare. You'll soon see, the professor replied cryptically, his image flickering slightly as if to underline the suspense. Earth's history is filled with periods of peace. But those periods were always preludes to even more devastating conflicts, the scale of which none of you have experienced. The student stared at the holographic professor, now silent, the gravity of his words settling in. They had come to learn about yet another planet's history, expecting nothing more than the usual lectures on ancient wars and eventual peace treaties. But this was different. Prepare yourselves, the professor concluded. You are about to witness the evolution of warfare through the eyes of humanity. And it will be unlike anything you've seen before. The classroom grew tense as the holographic professor began the next lesson, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of centuries of conflict. The shimmering holograms shifted, no longer displaying the serene images of Earth's landscapes. Instead, scenes of early human warfare came to life, primitive yet brutal. The alien students leaned in, their earlier skepticism beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet curiosity. You see here the earliest forms of human conflict, the professor began. The air filled with the sounds of clashing weapons, the thud of wooden clubs against bone, and the twang of bows loosing arrows. In these early tribal societies, survival was the primary goal. There was no grand strategy, no overarching political ambition. It was a fight for food, territory, and life itself. The images projected small groups of humans, clad in animal hides and wielding spears, engaging in vicious battles over resources. The students watched as the early tribes of Earth fought with a raw brutality unfamiliar to them. Most of their own species had evolved past this stage, using diplomacy or advanced technology to solve disputes long before such violence could break out. The scenes on display were almost incomprehensible. Unlike many of your own histories, humanity's early conflicts were not resolved through dialogue or negotiation, the professor continued. These people fought because they had no other choice. Their world was harsh, and their survival depended on their ability to dominate their enemies. One of the students, a slender being with metallic skin, raised a hand, its voice a series of clicking sounds. Why did they not seek peaceful solutions? Even at such a primitive level, there must have been other options. The professor paused, as though considering the question. Humanity, at this stage, had not yet developed the concept of diplomacy as you understand it. In fact, their environment did not allow for it. They lived in a world where strength and cunning were the only guarantees of survival. Those who attempted peace often found themselves at the mercy of more aggressive tribes. The holograms transitioned to larger skirmishes. The battles had evolved. Now the tribes were using more advanced weapons, simple but effective tools like bows, arrows, and crude axes. The students murmured among themselves, comparing what they saw to their own histories, but none could quite understand the intensity of human violence. These weren't battles fought for political gain or intellectual superiority. They were desperate, savage clashes for survival. And then, the professor's voice grew softer. As human societies developed, so did their warfare. The holograms shifted again, showing vast city-states and early kingdoms, their soldiers organized into formations that alien students recognized immediately as far more advanced. Egyptian chariots raced across the sands, archers fired volleys of arrows in unison, and infantry advanced in disciplined lines. The Greeks appeared next, their phalanxes forming impenetrable walls of shields and spears, followed by the Roman legions, their precision and discipline unmatched by anything the students had seen before in human history. These, the professor explained, are the early forms of organized warfare. As human societies grew, so did their ability to fight as cohesive units. They were no longer just fighting for survival as individuals, they were fighting as nations, as empires. A student, whose liquid-like body shimmered with shifting colors, expressed disbelief. They fought for control over others, even after they had achieved survival? Why did they continue this path of destruction? The professor nodded. You must understand, for humans, warfare wasn't just about survival by this point. It became about power, control, and influence. But even more than that, it became about strategy. The next series of holograms displayed battles from ancient times, showing how humans adapted to their environments and learned to outthink their enemies. The Battle of Thermopylae, where a small Greek force held off a vastly superior Persian army, left the students visibly impressed. Tactical ingenuity, discipline, and the ability to turn the tide of a seemingly hopeless situation, this was a level of warfare that many of the alien students had not expected from a species as young as humanity. They didn't just fight, the professor emphasized, they thought. They turned warfare into a science, an art form. The ability to outmaneuver and outthink their enemies was as important as brute strength. For humans, survival was no longer just about physical prowess, it was about strategic brilliance. Several students exchanged glances, clearly impressed. For them, warfare had always been something crude, something primitive. Yet here, they were witnessing a species that had taken the basic need for survival and transformed it into something much more complex. And here is where humanity differs from many of your own species, the professor said, his voice growing more serious. While many civilizations in the galaxy reached a point where they could settle their disputes through diplomacy or technological advancement, humans never let go of war as a means of shaping their future. They didn't just survive war, they thrived on it. They adapted, they evolved, and they learned to turn war into an extension of their societies. The next hologram displayed vast battlefields, showing humanity's innovations in military strategy. The use of cavalry, siege engines, and naval warfare demonstrated that humans had not just embraced warfare, but had become masters of it. The students were silent, absorbing the gravity of what they were seeing. The professor continued. Humanity's early wars were brutal, but they were also a training ground. Each battle, each conflict, taught them how to adapt, how to improve, and how to survive in a world that constantly threatened their existence. And as they evolved, so did their wars. A student with multiple eyes that blinked in different directions simultaneously raised a hand. But why? Why evolve this way? Surely there were other paths they could have taken. The professor's holographic eyes seemed to fixate on the student. Because for humans, survival at any cost became their instinct. Their world, their environment, was not one that allowed for peace to be the default state. Earth is a planet of scarcity, where conflict was often the only means of securing resources. But as their conflicts evolved, so did their society. In a strange way, war was not just a means of destruction, it was a catalyst for growth. The alien students sat in stunned silence. This was not the story they had expected to hear. They had anticipated tales of violence, yes, but not this evolution through conflict. The humans had taken warfare and turned it into something more than just survival. It was a driving force behind their development, their creativity, their very civilization. And now, the professor concluded, you begin to understand why humanity's history is so different from your own. For most of you, warfare was something to be discarded as your species advanced. For humans, it was something that helped them advance. The professor's tone grew somber as the holographic display transitioned to a new chapter of Earth's history. The once small, localized skirmishes of tribes and city-states were long gone, replaced by images of vast landscapes torn apart by mechanized warfare. The alien students, who had grown accustomed to the primitive violence of early humanity, now found themselves confronted with something far more chilling. Welcome to the 20th century, the professor began, his voice carrying the weight of humanity's darkest hours. This is a time when war reached an entirely new scale, a scale that few species in the galaxy have ever imagined, let alone experienced. World War I and World War II changed everything for humanity, and for the planet they called home. The display flickered, revealing scenes from the First World War. Trenches stretched across the landscape like deep scars, filled with soldiers huddled in mud and filth. The air was thick with the sounds of distant artillery and the cries of soldiers as they endured days, sometimes weeks, of relentless bombardment. The alien students watched with wide eyes, their expressions reflecting a mixture of disbelief and horror. World War I was one of the first truly global conflicts, the professor explained. It involved dozens of nations, millions of soldiers, and unprecedented destruction. Entire countries mobilized their populations for war, and it was unlike anything humanity had experienced before. A series of holographic images shifted between planes dogfighting in the skies, tanks lumbering across battlefields, and lines of infantry advancing under heavy fire. The sheer scale of the conflict was overwhelming to the alien students, many of whom came from species that had resolved their own planetary conflicts millennia ago, often through diplomacy or highly advanced technology. None of them had ever seen anything like the global devastation unfolding before them. One student, a being with delicate wings that shimmered with iridescent hues, hesitated before speaking, its voice soft yet incredulous. Why? Why did they continue? This suffering, it seems senseless. The professor's expression remained neutral, though there was a flicker of understanding in his holographic eyes. For humans, this war was driven by nationalism, alliances, and a complex web of political and economic tensions. It wasn't just about survival, it was about power, pride, and territory. But as you can see, the cost was unimaginable. The hologram zoomed in on soldiers in trenches, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow from exhaustion. The stench of death and decay seemed almost palpable through the projections. Even though the alien students were far removed from the battlefield, the horrors of trench warfare reached them. And then, the professor continued, came World War II. The display shifted again, this time showing the rise of totalitarian regimes, goose-stepping soldiers, and vast formations of tanks and airplanes. The alien students watched as the conflict unfolded, spanning nearly every continent. Cities were reduced to rubble, civilian populations caught in the crossfire, and armies clashed on an unprecedented scale. World War II took what was learned from the first global conflict and expanded it. It wasn't just soldiers fighting soldiers anymore. Entire nations became battlegrounds. Civilians were no longer spared. The casualties, both military and civilian, were beyond anything humanity had ever seen. The holograms displayed images of bombed-out cities, columns of refugees fleeing from advancing armies, and the eerie glow of firestorms consuming entire urban landscapes. The alien students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly disturbed by the sheer scope of destruction. One student, a large, muscular being covered in thick, armored scales, spoke with a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. Humans seemed to have perfected the art of destruction. But how did they benefit from it? How did they survive this? The professor turned, his gaze sweeping over the classroom. Through war, humanity accelerated its technological development at a pace that few species could match. Desperation, competition, and survival pushed humans to innovate in ways that forever changed their society and their world. The next series of holograms displayed rapid advancements in technology: airplanes that flew faster and higher than ever before, tanks with more firepower than entire armies, and weapons capable of wiping out entire cities. The alien students watched in stunned silence as humanity's ingenuity seemed to defy all limits. Many of the technologies you see now, radar, jet engines, rockets, were either born from or perfected during the global conflicts of the 20th century, the professor explained. Humanity's need to outdo their enemies, to survive, to win, drove them to innovate faster than any species had ever done during wartime. But it was the next image that drew the most visceral reaction from the students. The display showed the mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. The classroom fell into an eerie silence as the full weight of what the students were witnessing settled over them. This, the professor said softly, was the culmination of humanity's pursuit of destruction. The atomic bomb. Several students recoiled in shock, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what they were seeing. They had known about energy weapons, even planet-scale engineering projects, but this was something else entirely. The idea that a species would develop a weapon capable of annihilating entire cities, and use it, was a concept that shattered their perception of human nature. The being with the shimmering wings whispered, more to itself than to anyone else, "Why would they do this? Why would they create such a thing?" The professor's voice was tinged with an edge of grim understanding. Because humanity, in its pursuit of survival, has always sought to ensure that they could never be outmatched. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon, it was a statement. A statement that no matter how far war pushed them, they would find a way to come out on top. Even if it meant creating something capable of destroying their entire planet. The alien students were silent, their shock palpable. They had seen destruction before, but nothing on this scale. Nothing with such cold, calculated efficiency. The atomic bomb represented a new kind of warfare, a kind that even their most warlike species had never contemplated. And yet, the professor added, his voice softening, this was also a turning point for humanity. The destruction they unleashed on themselves forced them to confront their own nature. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that they had reached the point where their wars could end everything. The balance between survival and annihilation had never been so delicate. Several students exchanged uneasy glances. The professor's words lingered in the air, a stark reminder of just how close humanity had come to destroying itself. They had survived, yes, but at what cost? And as the lesson continued, the students began to realize just how different the human experience was from their own. The professor took a deep breath before continuing, signaling that the next chapter in Earth's history was as complex as it was dangerous. As the holographic display shifted, a dark cloud of tension seemed to loom over the classroom. The alien students, still processing the devastation of the world wars, found themselves pulled into yet another aspect of human warfare. But this time, the threat wasn't just about destruction, it was about the terrifying possibility of annihilation without a single shot being fired. The 20th century did not end with the Second World War, the professor began, his voice serious yet steady. In many ways, humanity's greatest challenge was just beginning. After the ashes of World War II settled, a new kind of conflict arose, one where no battles were fought directly, but the fear of total destruction hung over the planet for decades. This period became known as the Cold War. A series of holographic images appeared, showing a divided Earth. Lines were drawn, both ideologically and geographically, between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The alien students watched as scenes of political maneuvering, propaganda, and espionage played out before them. For a species that had evolved in constant warfare, this strange new era of posturing and silent threats puzzled them. "They didn't fight?" asked a student whose species communicated through subtle color changes on their skin. The question was one of genuine confusion. Why not? They had the means, the power. Why did they hold back? The professor's expression softened, knowing this concept would be difficult for many of them to grasp. That's the paradox of the Cold War. The world had never been closer to destruction, but it never happened. And the reason, quite simply, was fear. Fear of what would happen if either side pressed that final button. A hologram of a massive mushroom cloud reappeared for just a moment, reminding the students of the atomic devastation they had already seen. The professor explained further, by the end of World War II, humanity had developed weapons capable of annihilating entire cities. But during the Cold War, those weapons grew even more powerful, nuclear missiles that could wipe out entire continents. Both superpowers had thousands of these weapons, ready to launch at a moment's notice. One alien student, whose species evolved in a peaceful utopia, shuddered visibly. And yet, they built more of these weapons? Knowing they could destroy everything? Yes, the professor said, nodding grimly. This is where humanity's history takes a turn that few species have ever experienced. They called it mutually assured destruction, or MAD, for short. The idea was simple: if one side launched their nuclear weapons, the other side would respond in kind, and both would be destroyed. It was a stalemate, a balance of terror. Neither side could afford to strike, because they knew it would mean the end of everything. The alien students stared at the holograms in stunned silence, processing the sheer insanity of the concept. For most of them, the idea of preventing conflict through the threat of total annihilation was unfathomable. Their species had developed in different ways, many resolving conflicts long before they reached the point of total destruction. But humanity had walked right up to the edge of the abyss and stared into it. One of the more warlike alien students, a hulking creature with tusks protruding from its lower jaw, growled in frustration. Why didn't they just fight it out? End it. One victor, one loser. The professor raised a finger. Because it wouldn't have ended with a victor. There would have been no one left to claim victory. That's what made this period so dangerous, and so remarkable. Humanity, in its warlike nature, found itself in a position where continuing the fight would mean the end of their entire species. And so, they didn't fight. At least, not directly. The holographic display shifted again, showing images of proxy wars, Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan. The alien students leaned in, puzzled by this new type of conflict. There were soldiers, there were battles, but the superpowers themselves never engaged directly. The Cold War wasn't without violence, the professor explained. Instead of fighting each other directly, the superpowers fought through smaller conflicts around the world, proxy wars. They supported opposing sides, provided weapons, intelligence, and funding. In this way, they influenced global politics and extended their reach without ever risking total destruction. These wars were no less brutal, but they were fought far from the homelands of the superpowers. One alien student, covered in feathers that ruffled with excitement, spoke up. That's ingenious. They found a way to continue their conflicts without wiping themselves out. Yes, the professor agreed, it was a delicate dance of power and influence. But it wasn't just about military might. Espionage played a huge role. Spies, secret missions, and covert operations became the tools of war. Both sides sought to undermine the other without open conflict. It was a war fought in shadows. The students shifted in their seats, visibly impressed by the complexity of human strategy. The concept of fighting without fighting, of manipulating global events without ever engaging in direct combat, was something many of them had never encountered in their own histories. They began to see that humanity's approach to war was not just about brute force, it was about cunning, patience, and a willingness to play the long game. And yet, the threat of nuclear war still loomed large over the entire planet. The fear of global annihilation never went away, the professor continued. There were moments when the world came terrifyingly close to disaster. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, just one misstep, one misunderstanding, and the world could have been engulfed in nuclear fire. But somehow, despite all the tension, all the threats, humanity managed to avoid the worst outcome. They found ways to pull back from the brink, to de-escalate, even when it seemed impossible. The alien students, who had come to see humans as a deeply warlike species, began to understand a different side of humanity, a side capable of restraint, of diplomacy, of preventing war even when it seemed inevitable. They realized that while humans had perfected the art of war, they had also learned the art of survival, not just through battle, but through the careful balancing of power and threat. And that, the professor concluded, is perhaps one of the most remarkable things about humanity. Despite all their violence, all their wars, they also had the capacity to hold back, to prevent their own extinction. They lived for decades under the constant threat of destruction, yet they found ways to survive. To thrive, even. In the end, it wasn't just their weapons that saved them, it was their ability to navigate the razor's edge between war and peace. The students sat in contemplative silence. What they had just learned about humanity was a revelation. The species that had once seemed so reckless and war-hungry had proven to be more complex than they had imagined. They didn't just survive through conflict, they survived by mastering it, by understanding when not to fight, and by ensuring that even their greatest threats were kept in check. As the holographic displays dimmed, the professor stood quietly for a moment, allowing the gravity of everything he had just shared to sink in. The alien students, once eager to hear about Earth's wars, now seemed unsettled, grappling with the sheer scope of humanity's history. The silence that hung over the room was palpable, as though even the advanced technology of the classroom was reluctant to disturb it. "You've now seen the darkest parts of human history," the professor finally began, his voice low and reflective. "War is a thread that runs through much of our past. And, for many of you, I understand that this must seem like a cautionary tale, a story of a species on the edge of destroying itself over and over again." A few of the alien students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes still wide with shock. Some exchanged nervous glances, others stared at the professor, waiting for him to explain the deeper meaning behind it all. "But here's what I want you to take away from all this," the professor continued, his tone sharpening with purpose. "War, for humanity, has been more than just destruction. It has also been the catalyst for growth, innovation, and survival. When we fought, it wasn't just about defeating enemies, it was about evolving. It was about adapting to the harshest challenges our planet, and eventually the galaxy, threw at us." He gestured toward a glowing map of Earth, which hovered in the air beside him. The image shimmered, showing the ruins of past civilizations alongside modern, thriving cities. "Consider this," the professor said. "Every time humanity was faced with overwhelming odds, we didn't just fight to survive, we evolved. We built technologies, we developed strategies, we learned diplomacy. And while war may have pushed us to the brink of destruction, it also pushed us to the stars." A few of the alien students, particularly those from more warlike species, nodded slightly in understanding. The notion of war driving evolution wasn't entirely foreign to them. But for many others, those whose worlds had flourished in peace, this was a jarring concept to accept. However, the professor added, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the classroom, "What humanity has yet to decide is what we will become in the future. Will we continue to allow conflict to define us? Or will we learn from the brutal lessons of our past? That is the question we face now, as we take our place among the stars." A hologram of the Milky Way galaxy appeared, with a tiny speck of blue highlighting Earth's place in it. The alien students stared, entranced by the sheer insignificance of it. And yet, that tiny speck represented a species with the potential to shape the entire galaxy, perhaps through peace, perhaps through war. One of the alien students, a creature with skin that shimmered like liquid metal, raised a hand hesitantly. "If war has defined your species for so long," they asked, "how can we trust that you won't bring that same destruction to the galaxy?" The professor paused, clearly expecting this question. "That's a question many of us ask ourselves," he said solemnly. "And it's a fair one. Humanity has carried the scars of war for millennia. But we've also learned. We've learned that war is not always the answer, that sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquering others but from uniting them." He paused, then continued, his voice growing more passionate. "We are a species capable of incredible destruction, yes. But we are also capable of incredible creation. We've built wonders out of the ruins of war. We've healed wounds that seemed beyond repair. And now, as we step into the wider galaxy, we face a choice: do we continue to follow the path of violence, or do we find a new way forward? The classroom fell silent again as the students contemplated this. "I can't tell you what the future holds," the professor said softly, his gaze sweeping over the class. "But what I can tell you is that humanity's history of war has also given us something unique, an understanding of what's at stake. We know better than most the cost of violence, and it's that knowledge that might help us avoid repeating the mistakes of our past." A student from a peaceful, flower-like species raised a delicate hand. "But can a species so shaped by conflict really change? Can you truly leave behind what made you who you are?" The professor smiled faintly. "That's the ultimate question, isn't it? Can humanity evolve beyond its warlike nature, or are we doomed to repeat our past? I believe we can change, but it won't be easy. We've made strides: diplomacy, cooperation, peace agreements, but the temptation of war, the hunger for power, will always be there." He took a step closer to the students, his tone now deeply introspective. "It's not just about leaving war behind. It's about choosing when to fight and when to seek peace. It's about using our knowledge of war not to destroy, but to protect, to stand as guardians, not conquerors." A tense silence followed his words. The alien students, many of whom had come to the lesson thinking they would hear about yet another primitive species, were now filled with a sense of uncertainty. The humans, they realized, were unlike any species they had encountered before, a people defined by war, yet somehow capable of profound restraint and growth. As the lesson drew to a close, the professor left them with one final thought. Humanity's story is far from over. Our history has shown that we are adaptable, resilient, and, yes, dangerous. But what we choose to become in the galaxy, that will be decided in the years to come. And perhaps, one day, we will not be known as the species who brought war to the stars, but as the species who learned from it, and helped unite the galaxy in ways no one ever thought possible. The room remained quiet, filled with the weight of the professor's words. The alien students, each from worlds so different from Earth, were left to ponder the future of humanity. Would humans be the saviors of the galaxy, or its greatest threat? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: humanity's story was just beginning.